Tribune Jalion Marlaxia sat at the bar, nursing his drink, while the usual crowd of cadets and civilians drank and sang the war songs of the Grand Coalition. He'd been a soldier in the Grand Coalition armies for almost 70 galactic years. He'd risen from the lowest rank to commanding a Kexarch of 100,000 troops. For his loyal service, he was promoted to Tribune and given the option to retire or his pick of assignments. The service was all he knew, so he took the offer to teach at the academy. He drank alone most of the time. Most cadets were too intimidated to talk to him outside class. His rank, experiences, or sheer size kept most cadets from speaking to him when he was off duty. Unlike most of the academy instructors, he was one of those mythical beings, a combat veteran of many wars. Most instructors had combat experience, but usually just one or two conflicts. As part of his interview with the academy commandant, his service record was reviewed. He was surprised by some of the details in it. After 70 years of combat service, it all blurred together. He'd fought in 22 wars, 642 major engagements, numerous skirmishes, and more than a few barroom brawls. He shrugged at the last one. He came up through the ranks and became an officer by battlefield commission. He wasn't an officer and an aristocrat like most of the cadets he taught. He was almost 3 meters tall and massively muscled, like all soldiers from Tralaxia. Numerous scars crisscrossed his entire body, especially his 4 arms and the curled horns on his head. "Try Tribune Marlaxia," the young Keteran stuttered. "Yes, cadet," he replied while trying to remember its name. "Sir, if it's okay," the cadet asked, trying to overcome his nervousness. "We were talking about who were the best soldiers in the coalition military." The cadet looked to his friends for help, but none was given. "I don't know, sir," his voice barely audible. Jalian smiled and decided to take pity on the young Kataran. He took a pull from his drink and signaled the bartender for another. As she slid the drink to him, she shared that amused look she always had when he was going to tell a tale. After another pull at his fresh drink, he put it down and turned around on his stool. "You asked about the best soldiers in our military, but I will instead tell you of my experience with the best soldiers that I've ever fought beside." The rest of the bar's patrons quieted down as they realized they might get to hear him share some of his past experiences. They weren't part of our military, but one of the few allies willing to step up when the Razith invaded our space. Jalian's eyes stared at nothing as he tried to remember how long ago it was. About 30 cycles ago it was. They'd sent a large force against a small colony world, Razis VI, taking another pull from his drink before continuing. "I was just a Chiliad then, commanding a millinarch of heavy infantry." The entire Tetachar had been sent to evacuate the civilians before the Razith arrived. At the time, most of us thought sending 10,000 soldiers to evacuate 6,000 civilians was overkill. He shook his head before continuing. "But we hadn't met the Razith in combat before." Jalian looked around the room before continuing. "Cadets learn about the Razith in their 3rd year, so for the younger cadets and the civilians in the room, I better explain who the Razith were. The Razith were a species that originated from the fringe of the Zenectic sector, out on the galactic rim. That area had never been explored, being so far out." "What did they look like?" one of the cadets piped up. Jalian turned to look at the cadet. They were big, only slightly shorter than me. Their lower body was sinuous, and having no legs, they moved by lateral undulation. Their dorsal side was covered in short spikes that ended in a stinger that could inject paralytic venom in some species. They had 2 arms that ended in a 6-digit manus with retractable claws, and another pair of appendages that could function as arms for grasping or be used to increase their speed when moving. They had 2 sets of eyes, one for normal light and the other for low light. They had a wide maw with rows of sharp fangs for ripping apart flesh and meat. Their whole body was covered in tough scales that sometimes deflect laser and plasma bolts. If you didn't hit them square on, Draining his mug, Jalian continued, "To them, other sapients were either food or slaves." He looked around to see the entire bar focused on him. A delegation sent to make contact after they attacked a small outpost found that out the hard way. Only one of the group was allowed to live to deliver a single message: surrender or die. The Gatana Council didn't take them seriously and put together a small fleet to punish these upstarts. After all, the survivor reported they only had 12 ships. None came back. Jalian drained the rest of his drink and set the mug on the bar. A recon ship that had been sent out returned with word that the Razith fleet was far larger than reported. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands of escorts, and what we assumed were troop ships. With our fleet scattered across coalition territory, we needed to buy time for them to join the Grand Fleet. So dozens of squadrons were sent to evacuate all colonies and stations directly in the enemy's path. Jalian said, his eyes staring at nothing as he spoke. Why, we didn't know the Razith had also sent out their groups of raiders to seize any supplies they could, and in their case, the colonists were just another source of food. Jalian began to reach for his mug, remembering it was empty just before grasping it, so he was pleasantly surprised to find it full again. With none of our ships capable of atmospheric maneuvering, we were reduced to using shuttles and other smaller craft to load the colonists and their belongings. He'd finally convinced the fleet commander that they were here to rescue the colonists and deny the Razith of supplies. Being carnivorous, the colonists' animals were a food supply for them and couldn't be left behind. He also pointed out that simply destroying them to the point of being inedible would take too long, agitate the colonists, and significantly slow down the evac time more than just taking the animals would. One of the older cadets spoke up. "Sir, are you okay?" Bringing Jalian back to the present. "I apologize, I was lost in a memory. Now where was I?" he thought out loud. "Ah yes, the evacuation," he said. "We'd been at it for several centacs when we received word of hostile ships entering the system. The fleet commander took all but 2 destroyers to engage the enemy while we tried to speed up the evacuation. But you can only move so fast with the number of shuttles we had." Taking another pull of his drink, "Good thing it isn't very strong, or I'd be under a table before I am done," he said to himself. My Tedric conferred with the fleet commander, and a distress signal was sent out for more ships to assist in the effort. He was also informed of several ships heading for the planet's surface, most likely ground troops. The area around the settlement wasn't very defensible, so we moved the LZ to a nearby plateau and moved the rest of the colonists that way. The colonists would often take their livestock to graze on the top of the plateau, so there was a well-worn path. And even better, some of the livestock naturally began to climb the trail to their grazing spot. The path up was mostly rock and dirt with some vegetation here and there. He continued. It leveled off into 3 different benches as you ascended. This allowed a brief rest for some of the slower colonists. The plateau was bulbous where the pathway exited on it. Sheer cliffs along nearly all sides provided added protection, and the land narrowed to a bluff over the river, far below. A wide spot at the farthest end of the bluff was just big enough for an LZ. His hands helped show what he meant. The Tedarch began breaking off Millenarch at the base and at each bench to hold off the Razith. Julian recalled, each level could be supported from the defensive line above, and with either side of that steep slope being a sheer cliff face, it looked like a tough weonade to crack. After deploying 5 Millenarch along the trail from the bottom, over 3 benches and a line on top, that left 5 others to assist in the evac and build backup defensive lines. Jalian was starting to enjoy sharing this with the crowd. He didn't talk about it often, but oh, did he dream about it. The nightmares weren't as frequent now, but every so often they'd plague his sleep. The sights, sounds, and smells of that desperate fight. The screams of the wounded and dying, feeling the battle slip out of his control. We got word from the fleet commander that his battle was going well, but neither side had an edge. Jalian said, we also got some intel back from AI-controlled recon craft about the multiple formations of the enemy sacking and burning anything they came across and all heading our way. His throat getting dry, he took a drink from his mug and then continued. We had our first contact with the Razith not long after that report. There were less than a Millenarch of them. We opened up as soon as they came into range and got the nasty surprise of finding out that their scales gave them some defense against laser and plasma fire. Here and there, one went down, but nowhere near the numbers expected. His eyes took on a haunted look. We hadn't even eliminated a quarter of them before they hit the first line of defense and rolled right over it. A favorite tactic was to grab one of our troopers with the lower set of appendages on the torso, entangle them, and then either bite into them, sting them with their tail, or simply rip them apart. I'd never seen such savagery, at least by that time of my life. The Tedarch sent some of the troopers from the plateau to remove the wounded and dying. The dead were piled up and incinerated with thermocharges. Taking another drink, he continued, "Normally, we would try to give the appropriate fallen funerary services, but we didn't have the time, and we knew what happened to our dead." He also sent more troops to reinforce the first line. Jalian paused before adding, "It wasn't enough. We barely managed to fend off 2 more attacks and had to abandon the first line of defense." Jalian said, "And even more worrying were more and more Razith arriving on the field. It was becoming obvious that we couldn't hold them off forever. Evacuation was only about halfway done, and we'd already lost over a millinarch of dead and wounded." He shook off his thoughts and continued, "The next assault nearly destroyed what morale we had left. We found out the damn things could climb the rock walls. They were hitting us on every level and atop the plateau. It was no longer an organized battle, but a swirling mass of small groups fighting for their lives and to keep the Razith from the civilians." Jalian suppressed a shudder at the recalled fear of that chaos. Several people in the crowd asked the same question, "Who?" At the crowd's bewilderment, he explained, "Yes, I know that for most of you, your only experience is with their traders and travelers. And their military forces are downright scary. They aren't as big or strong as other soldiers in our armies, nor do they have any natural weapons or armor. What they do have are units that function just as well independently as they do in larger formations. Their troops are well-trained, disciplined, and brave to the point of idiocy." Jalian gave a slight smile as he remembered the elation that someone heard their call. Their largest supply ship could land and take off from a planetary surface and had plenty of room to take the rest of us off the planet in one shot. But the plateau wasn't big enough to land on, but they solved the problem with human efficiency. Jalian continued, "They set down on a nearby ridge and used the shuttles to ferry people and animals over to it. It was a far quicker process than going back and forth between a ship in orbit. But I am getting ahead of myself. We were on the verge of being overrun when a noise I'd never heard before came from above and behind me. Humans in black body armor and firing projectile weapons were advancing down the path and firing into the mass of Razith fighters." Jalian looked around the bar, seeing the crowd hung on his every word. "With their help, we managed to not only repulse the Razith from the path and plateau, but also their dropships chased them back to the settlement." Jalian drained his mug again before continuing. "I'd never seen a human up close before. They were bipedal and had a single pair of arms. After their leader removed her helmet, I also saw they had 2 eyes on the front of their face and 2 ears on the side of their head. Directly below and between their eyes was a single proboscis and a single mouth with small teeth. Most of them had some form of fur-like tufts on their head." The human commander came up to me, evidently familiar with our rank badges, and greeted me. They officially called them Gorgons. It refers to a creature from their ancient mythologies. Something to keep in mind, humans are fond of humor and understating the difficulty or danger of a situation. They are also fond of calling things by nicknames, which could be good or bad, human military personnel most of all. Jalian recalled the enjoyment he got when they later taught him banter. If a human likes you, they like to joke around with you. That is usually a good thing. But I found very few things scarier than when a human is deadly serious. Jalian paused before continuing. When they get like that, some serious violence is about to happen. They always fight hard, but often in a more clinical fashion like we do. I was once on a scouting mission with 24 human Marines. We were investigating why a Barkiri settlement stopped responding to hails. It turned out that Bagrati pirates had hit the settlement and killed or kidnapped the people to sell at the slave markets. Jalian could still remember the anger he felt at the scene, but they didn't take the Barkiri children with them. They executed them. As I was saying, the Marine captain introduced herself and we began exchanging tactical information. It was also around this time that I found out I was the most senior officer left alive and became in charge of this mission. So we left a squad of human Marines on the last bench and started to build a defensive line across the neck of the bluff. We also dug out a sheltered area for the refugees to hide while waiting. That is also when I found out Captain Mendez only brought 250 Marines. I asked the captain about it and she smiled and told me each Marine is worth 10 of those damn Jabbas, so we got them outnumbered. Several cadets laughed at that, enjoying the disdain shown to the Razith. I only had just over 4,000 combat-effective coalition troopers, 1,000 of which I sent to guard the human vessel, and to take all injured or dead. The Razith were horrible shots and preferred volume of fire over accuracy. I probably wouldn't be here if they could shoot worth a damn, Jalian said, kidding on the square. I placed half a Millenarch with the refugees and spread some pickets along the edge of the plateau. Meanwhile, the humans took position on the front line with a pair of rapid-fire railguns. We'd got the front-line trenches and secondary breastworks dug when the squad of Marines came jogging back and said they were coming. The last time they got into the trenches where vicious melee combat broke out. The humans pointed out a weak spot under their chin that weapons fire or even knives could penetrate with ease. With this knowledge, we gave better than we got, as an old human saying goes. But the cost had been heavy. More than half of my remaining troops were down. Fortunately, more wounded than dead. Jalian said, and despite their much stronger armor, less than 100 Marines were still able to fight. At least we finished evacuating the last of the refugees and their animals. Now we were ferrying over our dead and wounded. The Razith came again and we barely drove them back. Jalian paused before continuing. It was at that point we abandoned the trenches and moved everyone that was left to the second line. And that was when tragedy struck. During a lull, the surviving troops fell back and the Marines manned that last line of defense. With a look of great sadness on his face, Jalian continued, word came from above that a large number of Razith ships were inbound, and the surviving coalition ships and human ships were forced to scoop up all their escape pods and what survivors they could get to on the wrecked ships and fall back to the ships stationed above us. The first shuttle landed and I got the last of my Hale troopers and the last of the human and coalition dead and wounded. We lifted off to allow the other shuttle to land, but Razith's fire hit it and turned it into a brilliant fireball, crashing into the valley floor below. 32 Marines, including Captain Mendez, were still on the bluff below. They'd fallen back to the LZ with the Razith not far behind. I rushed to the cockpit to tell the pilot to go back for them, but he told me they were too heavily loaded. I suggested abandoning the dead to make room. He agreed and I called the captain to be ready for pickup, but she said there was no time. She ordered the pilot to return to their ship and dock. She then called the freighter and told them to lift off as soon as we docked. Our pilot mumbled something about Valhalla and practically crash-landed us in the freighter hangar. We hadn't even dropped the ramps before I heard the doors clang shut and felt the engines roar as we lifted off. I asked the pilot what the phrase, "drop Thor's hammer," meant, and he just turned on a monitor hooked into the fleet feed from a recon drone. The Marines were surrounded by the Razith and fighting hard with most of them down. Jalian sighed. It was then I saw a streak of light race down and hit the LZ. It turned into a massive fireball, and then a massive plume of smoke and debris rose from it into a huracan fruit-shaped cloud. I looked at both pilots and saw tears on their faces. One of them explained to me that drop Thor's hammer meant to drop a nuke on their position. And that is why I say they are the best I ever fought with. They came to help us when they didn't have to. They fought shoulder to shoulder with us, and in the end, they sacrificed themselves to make sure we would survive. Jalian scanned the crowd, seeing them shocked, amazed, and even saddened at that action. And now, cadets, it's late and we get up early. And with that, Jalian set down his empty mug, signed his credit chit, and left the bar.
If you finish this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.